So here's a bit of truth that should be self-evident but is rarely explicitly voiced. Fat people mostly want the same things from life as thin people. We want to be loved. We want to be happy. We want to be respected, to be comfortable in our own skin, to be held, to dance, to rebel, to laugh, to rage, to feel joy, to feel well, to be cared for when we are not feeling well. We want, to reference Rachel Wiley's powerful poem, to exist in this world without hurting. There are few things that sadden me more than to hear a fellow fat person say that they think they can only ever reach this kind of existence if they lose weight and become thin. I do not blame them, though. We live in a fatphobic world where fat people are stigmatized and bullied every day. During a COVID lockdown, somebody in the supermarket actually physically removed a pizza and a bar of chocolate from my cart while saying, "Fat people shouldn't eat that, especially during a pandemic." Just the other day I was hiking and I greeted a passing cyclist, smiling kindly, and he said, "Ew, gross. Don't look at me, you disgusting pig." On Twitter, no matter what I write about in my columns, people use my weight as a way to put me down. After I wrote about fireworks, "Your column sucks. New Year's resolutions, stop eating like a pig." After I wrote about the need for more solidarity with black people, "Stupid fatso, go lose weight, then at least you will be useful instead of a drain on our healthcare system." After I wrote about the then very recent death of my grandfather, "You are so stupid, fat and ugly." What's important to remember is not that these people are unforgivably rude. I mean, they are, but that's not the point. The point is that they use exactly the same stigmatizing ideas about fat people as so many others in our society. That fat people are lazy, unintelligent, unhealthy, they lack willpower, and so on. They repeat, albeit more harshly, the dominant discourse around fat people. Or, as this discourse usually puts it, people who are overweight or who are suffering from obesity. These negative stereotypes about fat people are both everywhere and rarely disputed. They have also been widely researched, so allow me to give you a brief overview of the science. Children, as young as 3 years old, can distinguish between fat and thin people, and they know that fat is the undesirable condition of the two and use this information to exclude fat children. For instance, children would rather not drink something they think was prepared by a fat child because the association with fat disgusts them. When pupils are asked to make a list of kids they want to play with, the fat kids consistently end up at the bottom. Gym teachers think fat students are less strong, less cooperative, and less socially skilled. American students, in one study, would rather date someone with a sexually transmitted disease than someone who is fat. Almost 1/4 of all adults say they would rather be depressed than fat. 16% would rather be blind. When applying for a job, fat people have 35% less chance of being hired than thin people who are exactly as competent. After a period of 7 years on a job, someone's weight was a better predictor of how much salary that person earned than their IQ. A fat woman makes around $30,000 a year less than a very thin female colleague. More than half of all primary care physicians thought of their fat patients as unattractive, ugly, and non-compliant. Over 60% assumed fat people would be thin if only they had been more motivated. 1/3 of all nurses thought fat people were disgusting and they would rather not care for them. When participating in a study about implicit bias, a majority of doctors judged their fat patients to be lazy and worthless. These stereotypes matter because in real life they lead to discrimination. Behind these percentages lie stories of real pain, and real suffering. Like the story of Rebecca Hiles, who told what happened to her to writer Maya Dusenberry. Rebecca was a young fat woman who was always out of breath. It seemed to her like the pneumonia she had at 17 never really went away. Despite that, she went to college, where she took up dancing and hiking despite the problems persisting. By the time she was 20, she was coughing up blood. She was prescribed asthma medication and told it was because she was fat. When she was 23, she started having such intense coughing fits that she sometimes lost control of her bladder or had to vomit. She was now too exhausted to hike, but the doctors kept telling her that her symptoms were all clearly weight-related. After another bloody coughing fit, she arrived at the ER, where one doctor actually saw her and not her weight and ordered a CT scan. It turned out Rebecca had a tumor in her left lung that by now had done so much damage that the whole lung had to be removed because the bottom half was nothing but black rotting tissue. If she had been diagnosed swiftly and properly, the lung could have been saved, she was told. But instead she recalled how every doctor she ever saw before that ER doctor kept telling her that she was sick because she was fat. So here's another bit of truth. Almost every fat person has a story like this. I have a story like this. Maybe not as cruel and devastating as Rebecca's, but still. In most fat people's lives, at one point there has been disbelief, delayed diagnosis, unnecessary pain. The weight of anti-fat stigma weighs much more heavily on us than our fat ever could. Our fat is just there. It doesn't disrespect us, it doesn't abuse us, it doesn't gaslight us. It doesn't tell us we're fat when we're actually sick. What this means is that as a fat person, you are never really safe. And this unsafeness is entangled with the ways of understanding fatness that are most dominant in our society. Sociologist Abigail Sagi writes about these ways, or as she calls them, frames, in her book What's Wrong with Fat. It's important to note how these frames work. They guide our thinking about fat people in a certain direction, to a point where many people only see the fat but not the human being. Reliance on particular frames can make it difficult or impossible to perceive contradictory information, writes Sagi. This contradictory information includes anything from evidence that somebody is clearly very ill to the acknowledgement that a fat person is a person who may or may not want to be thin, but most certainly wants to be happy, held, loved, and respected. The most dominant frame Sagi mentions is the frame of fatness as a health problem. It turns fatness into a matter of life and death. And how could a desire to have fun, dance, or feel joy possibly be more important than that? It imposes a discourse which revolves around words like excess death, burden to the healthcare system, and of course, risk. Risk is a fascinating word. In general terms, it means something like the possibility of loss, harm, or injury, or the chance of something having a negative effect. But when you're fat, it becomes something that, in the eyes of others, you are. You are the risk. In both society and the doctor's office, the risk of having a fat body is no longer a chance or a possibility. It's a certainty. Bad things will happen to you, they say. And it is your responsibility to stop them from happening by becoming thin. In a beautiful essay, the American poet Jordan Imani Keith writes about the words at risk. She begins by writing about the spring chinook, which is a kind of fish, a salmon to be precise. The spring chinook populations in the watersheds around Route 20 are labeled at-risk populations, she writes. They are protected under the Endangered Species Act. Protecting an endangered species means changing the practices in an entire ecosystem to safeguard their survival. It means managing the loss of their habitat, the turbidity of their waters, the surface water runoffs from the street that threatens them, etc. In short, these salmons are taken care of. Keith then talks about the inner city teenagers, often growing up in poverty, who she takes camping every summer to do volunteer work on hiking trails at North Cascades National Park. My youth crews are black, she writes, Latino, urban. This is what a woman at a party hears when I describe them. Oh, you work with at-risk youth, she says. She doesn't hear volunteer, college student, intern, outdoor leader. The at-risk label, Keith writes, is different for youth than it is for salmon. At risk isn't a protection, it is a limitation, a judgment, an assumption. In not all, but enough ways, the situation is the same for fat people. We are not salmons. Nobody is really caring for us or safeguarding our situation. For instance, while there is an abundance of programs intending to turn fat people into thin people, I have yet to come across a program covered by insurance or offered at a regular hospital that helps fat people become fitter or happier, regardless of whether they will lose weight in the process. Instead, all programs focus on a form of dieting or on lifestyle change, which is just dieting by another name, even though science has shown over and over and over again that dieting doesn't work for 95% of all people and makes you miserable to boot. There isn't even enough concern about the ecosystem of at-risk fat people to remedy one of the very largest threats to our health and well-being, namely stigmatization and discrimination. For instance, feeling unhappy with your own body, measured in a study as the difference between your actual and your desired weight, said more about someone's physical and mental health than a person's body mass index, or BMI. And in another large study, being discriminated against gives you a 60% bigger chance of premature death, independent of your BMI. So instead of our being at risk leading to real help, it is seen as a flaw, something we have to remedy. Side effects be damned. Because if you're fat, you're not only assumed to be at risk, you are also to blame. This brings us to another influential frame that Abigail Segui calls the morality frame. In this frame, fat people are seen as immoral, as sloths and gluttons, doing nothing but sitting on the couch, stuffing their faces with junk food. Fatness in this frame isn't a matter of genetics or luck or the omnipresent availability of cheap, high-calorie foods. It is a weakness, a poor choice. Fat is something you can justifiably resent a person for. While this resentment in more civilized discourse is often worded as a health concern, what actually lies underneath it all is a moral panic about fat people. Moral panics, Professor Kathleen Lebesco writes in her essay Fat Panic and the New Morality, tends to start with exaggeration. While the science about the relation between weight and health is not really all that straightforward, Dutch newspapers regularly sported headlines like, "Gluttony is killing the Netherlands," "Obesity will become a disaster." The Director General of the Health Department once said, "The obesity epidemic has the characteristics of an assassin and the effect of a nuclear disaster." Yeah. During a moral panic, those who do not participate in such alarmism are met with hostility, Lebesco says. Hatred even in these never nuanced social media times. And so the panic reinforces itself again and again until you are left with a moral discourse that is much more black and white than the science ever was, and which ultimately harms us all, both fat and thin persons, because in this discourse, discrimination against fat people is justified, and thin people have to live their lives in fear of becoming fat and thus becoming folk devils themselves. In our current state of societal fat panic, there is no refuge for anybody. Nobody is safe. There are, however, alternative frames that are helpful rather than harmful. To return once again to the work of Abigail Segui, she mentions two. The first is what she calls the diversity frame, which sees fatness not as a health problem or moral failing, but simply as a matter of neutral difference, like having brown or blue eyes, or being short or tall. This is the frame mostly used by the body acceptance or body positivity movement. It encourages all people, including fat people, to embrace their body as it is and actively contradicts the notion that it would be better if all people would turn thin as soon as possible. Not going to happen, these diversity-minded folks say. I do not need to diet, I do not need to be cured, I'm fine as I am and I deserve to be respected by society with the body I have. The other frame Segui mentions is the human rights frame. While the diversity frame focuses on individual struggles, this human rights frame focuses on changing the system, on changing society. This is what fat rights activists do. They state that living a life free of weight-based discrimination, bullying and hatred is a social justice issue. It should not be conditional on anything. You have the right to be respected and cared for, just as you are. You have the right to refuse weight loss surgery and still get full access to health care. You have the right to the same medical tests and treatment as your thin peers. You have the right not to be made fun of in class. You have the right to dance with all your wobbly bits out. You have the right to wear a crop top in public. You have the right to stay fat. Everything else is a form of oppression. You have the right to stay fat is, incidentally, the title of a great little feminist book by Virgie Tovar, in which she talks about rights and oppression. While we have spent the last 25 years cleaning up the sexist residue in our vocabulary, she writes, we have been living our woman-hating methods of control via our dinner plates and our bathroom skills, often not even knowing that this is what we were doing. We are giving away our lives, our time, our energy, our claim to pleasure, our desire, our power, one bite at a time. Submission has taken on a new face, where once we were barred from access to meaningful employment and the right to vote, sexism today has morphed into skipped meals and too many hours spent at the gym. As Naomi Wolf famously wrote in The Beauty Myth, dieting is the most potent political sedative in women's history. This is an intersectional issue. Fat women in particular, Tovar writes, are being gaslighted by society. There are real cultural problems like sexism, body shame, fatphobia and merited injustices many of us are dealing with all the time, and yet we were told over and over again by mainstream narratives that these problems reside within us. The real problem is that women and non-binary folks are angry, and we are trained to turn that anger inward and experience it as shame. And yet we are told, she writes, and we believe, that the problem is our body. The real problem is diet culture, and yet we are told and we believe that the problem is our inability to be thin. The real problem is that we live in a country that promotes size-based bigotry, and yet we are told and we believe that the problem is that we are not healthy enough. The real problem is a culture that uses weight as a proxy for humanity and morality, and yet we are told and we believe that the problem is that we don't know how to eat correctly. The real problem is that women and non-binary folks don't feel like we can eat what we want or wear what we want or live how we want, and yet we are told and we believe that we can fix this existential crisis through controlling portion size. The real problem, she continues, is that our culture is maintained through sexism, through racism, misogyny, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, healthism, and classism that erodes the physical, spiritual, and mental health of all people, and yet we are told and we believe that the problem is that we aren't trying hard enough. When I was asked to give this talk, I named it, "It Hurts to Exist Like This." Looking for safety in a fatphobic society. So how do we find safety? What we need, I believe, are two things. We need to change this culture, our society, this way of living that isn't good for any of us, and especially those of us who belong to marginalized groups. And secondly, we need to claim the right to liberate ourselves. I am not talking about acceptance. Me and my fat body do not wish to be tolerated. I do not want to be reluctantly endured. I want to be loved. I want to dance. I want to feel joy. I want to be free. Free from discrimination, from stigmatization, free from hate and self-hate, free from punishment and self-punishment, from loathing and self-loathing. The very good news, to end on an upbeat, is that a growing number of fat people are starting to free themselves. A few years ago, the Dutch Central Bureau of Statistics showed that 1 in 5 fat folks were happy with their weight. A couple of years later, this number had increased to 1 in 4. I considered this to be a wonderful development, but most people were less than optimistic. Disturbing was the word a large organization promoting a healthy weight for children used. Talk shows went on inviting thin people to discuss this new problem of all those happy fat people. Don't they know they're not healthy, they said. Don't be so satisfied with yourself. Be different, be thinner, be less. Stop existing like that. In response, I wrote this, a short history of my fat body. I was 10 years old when during a gymnastic performance, I tried to hide my big belly behind my arm because I was ashamed. I wanted to use my other arm to hide my thighs too, but I couldn't make it work. I was 11 when I wrote in my diary, I don't want to be fat. Why am I such a disgusting fat pig? I was 14 when my parents got divorced. For months, I ate almost nothing. People said, oh, you're looking good. I was 15 when I started to feel okay enough to start eating again. I gained some weight. People asked, are you all right? I was 16 when I started dating a boy who was so not right for me. But I stayed with him because who would want me? I was 18 when for a while I didn't care how fat I got. Maybe my body could be a fortress and my fat could be a wall that kept men at bay so I would never get raped again. I was 20 when a wonderful boy told me I was beautiful, and I answered that I loved everything about him, but we didn't believe each other. I was 23 when I started to trust the love of my life when he said he loved me just the way I was. I was 24 and pregnant when the OB at the birth center told me my weight already made me a bad mother. I was 29 when I went to the doctor because I was always in pain. That's tough, he said. Try to lose some weight. I was 32 when I went to see the doctor again. I was still in pain, but by now I was also sick as a dog. My hair was falling out and I was peeing blood. Oh, said the doctor, have you tried to lose weight yet? I was 33 when I went out to buy some shapewear underpants. And suddenly I thought, standing in that store, no. My belly is wobbly because I carry 2 babies. My embarrassing floppy upper arms held a dear friend when he cried because he had a broken heart. My fat legs carried me to the woods every time life got too much. My body does not deserve to be punished and constricted. It deserves my compassion. It deserves my love. To let go of self-hate, to be happy in the body you have, to find the strength within yourself to stop fighting your own body and instead fight the way our society treats that body isn't disturbing. It isn't a problem to be solved. It is the end of a long struggle, both with yourself and the fatphobic world. And every single time, a fat person manages to find refuge, to feel safe, to love themselves, to stand up for themselves and to fight back, despite the mess and the hurt of it all, it is a revolutionary act. Every time It is a fucking victory. Thank you.